Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. Today I want to go through numbers 6 through 10 of my top 10 books on guns in America. Okay, let's count down my top 10 books on American gun culture, starting with number 10. You all know that my focus is on gun culture, not gun violence, so I don't study criminology and epidemiology, but my number 10 on my list is in fact a book called Firearms and Violence in American Life. It was a staff report to the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, written by George Newton and Frank Zimring. And the reason that I put this 1969 book on my top 10 list is because the arguments about gun violence that you see today exactly mirror what Newton and Zimring said already in 1969. So in addition to talking about the run-up in gun ownership that they were seeing in the 1960s, they deal with firearms and accidents, firearms and suicide, firearms and crime, firearms and collective violence. They dismiss the significance of firearms for purposes of self-defense and ultimately conclude more firearms violence. So again, if you want to understand everything that you need to know about the way that gun violence prevention research is done today, it's all already here in this 1969 book, including lots of suggestions for gun control following their conclusion that more firearms leads to more firearms violence. Okay, number 9 on my list, a book about the history of guns in America. It's actually not Michael Belisle's Arming America, because he lost his job at Emory and had his Bancroft Prize taken from him for making up data in his desire to argue that guns were not a normal part of life in early America. He had to make up the data. And so instead, my number 9 book is Clayton Kramer's response to Michael Belisle, called Armed America: the story of how and why guns became as American as apple pie. And he marshals lots of evidence, and very interesting evidence in my view, from journals and travelogues that talked about how people used guns in their everyday lives in early America. But I particularly appreciate his conclusion in the epilogue. He says, "It seems almost inconceivable that anyone could seriously argue, after having read the evidence, that America was not, from the very beginning, a society in which guns played a fundamental part. For the collective military purpose of each colony, for the defense of individual families and isolated settlements, as symbols of being a citizen with the duty to defend the society, and more than occasionally to demonstrate that nothing has changed in the human condition since Cain slew Abel." Okay, book number 8 is William Tonsow's Gun and Society: The Social and Existential Roots of the American Attachment to Firearms. And this book, I think, is really underrated, in part because it was published by the University Press of America, which at the time that this book was published in 1982 was essentially like self-publishing, only worse than self-publishing today. I don't know whether you can see that, but the book is basically, looks like it was photocopied from manuscript with a Courier font. And so it's incredibly difficult to read this book. You have to really want it. But if you do read the book, you'll get some really good things out of it. And I think maybe one of the reasons why Tonsow had to publish this with the University Press of America rather than another publisher is because his ideas run so counter to the dominant academic narratives of guns as being bad. And he rather argues for what he calls a phenomenological approach. I don't know that it's necessarily a phenomenological approach, but he talks about the practical, the recreational, and the symbolic functions of guns for people. In my work for the Annals on tracing the evolution of gun culture, I really was able to draw a lot on his characterizations of the recreational uses of guns in the 19th century. So if you want to struggle through reading a book that's set in Courier font, check out William Tonso's book, Gun and Society. Okay, number 7 is a book by Nick Johnson called Negros and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms. And there's been a lot of books published recently trying to recover the Black tradition, I'd say maybe a subaltern tradition of gun ownership among African Americans throughout American history, in the abolitionist movement, in the early civil rights movement, in the late civil rights movement. Everybody focuses on the Black Panthers, but that was really just the culmination of things that have been happening through history. This is a history of a tradition of arms for personal and communal self-defense among African Americans in the United States that Johnson really helps to recover. And he sets that Black tradition of arms against the focus on gun control, which often either emanates from African American communities or is directed toward African American communities where levels of homicidal gun violence and criminal gun violence are typically much higher. So he balances off that tradition with the conventional wisdom of today, which is much more strongly for gun control among African Americans and toward the African American community. And rounding out the second half of the top 10, coming at number 6, is Abigail Cohn's book from the early 2000s called Shooters: Myths and Realities of America's Gun Cultures. And the title here is very significant because she wants to issue a corrective. She's an anthropologist and she studied some shooting clubs in the San Francisco Bay Area where she was a student. Obviously, that has limitations in its own right, but she takes that case study and really generalizes from it in some interesting ways. And again, one of the most interesting, and it's a useful corrective for me, always with my concept of gun culture 2.0, is to highlight the diversity of gun cultures in America. And so let me just read a little bit from her conclusions. She writes, "The gun culture is multi-layered, multifaceted institution made up of diverse, complex subcultures. Examples of gun-owning subcultures include the police, the military, farmers and ranchers, hunters, sport shooters, gun collectors, some right-wing militia groups, some white supremacist groups, some feminist groups, some gay groups, and some Black civil rights groups. Obviously, or not so obviously, depending on who you're reading, not every gun owner is a member of the NRA. In fact, many gun owners are not members of the NRA. However, many of these groups and individuals have thoroughly integrated guns into their lives." So I love that she highlights the diversity of American gun culture in countering what she found even 20 years ago when she was doing her work, the same thing that I find, a lot of dismissive attitudes towards guns and gun owners, and a lot of misunderstandings about them, not surprisingly, as a result. Next week, I'm going to highlight the first half of the top 10, numbers 1 to 5, so stay tuned for that.